Imagine turning on the television in 1968. The family is sitting in the living room. Dinner is still warm on the table, and on the screen appears something Americans had never seen before. Wounded soldiers, cities on fire, a war that seemed impossible to win. For the first time in history, a war was being broadcast directly into American homes. But the question that began echoing across millions of living rooms was simple. Was the war being won, or was something being hidden? And what happened next would forever change the relationship between war, media, and public opinion in the United States. Today we're going to show how television changed the way Americans saw the war, the moment when the nation's trust began to break, the event that shocked the world, and why, after that, no American war would ever be shown in the same way again. If you enjoy real stories that reveal how wars truly change nations, leave a like and let's begin. It started in the quiet of an American living room. The television flickered softly in the corner. A family sat around the dinner table. Plates clinked. Someone reached for the salt. It felt like any other evening in the United States during the 1960s. And then the broadcast began. Grainy footage appeared on the screen. A helicopter hovered over a dense jungle. Soldiers stepped carefully through tall grass. The sound of distant gunfire crackled through the television speaker. For the first time in American history, a war was not just being reported. It was being watched. Night after night, millions of Americans turned on the evening news and saw something no previous generation had ever seen before. Not drawings, not delayed photographs printed in newspapers days later. They saw the war unfold almost in real time. Cameras followed young American soldiers, moving through thick Vietnamese jungles. Reporters stood beside landing zones where helicopters dropped off fresh troops. Medics rushed wounded men onto evacuation choppers while rotors thundered above them. This was not the distant, carefully filtered version of war that Americans had known during earlier conflicts. This felt immediate, and sometimes uncomfortably real. Television had become the most powerful window into the battlefield. Every evening, trusted anchors delivered the news directly into American homes. Among them was one of the most respected voices in the country, Walter Cronkite. For millions of viewers, he wasn't just a journalist. He was a steady presence. Calm, reliable, trusted. When he spoke, people listened. At first, the reports sounded familiar. Military briefings described progress. Officials explained that the United States was containing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The strategy, Americans were told, was working, but the images on television were harder to control. Viewers began seeing scenes that raised quiet questions. Foot patrols moving through endless jungle terrain, villages damaged after firefights, young soldiers speaking into cameras with exhaustion in their eyes. The war did not look simple, and it did not look close to ending. Still, the broadcasts continued every night. The cameras kept rolling. Correspondents traveled with units in the field, filming what they saw as events unfolded. For many Americans, this became a routine. Dinner, the evening news, and the war. But something subtle was beginning to shift. The more the public watched, the more the conflict felt less like a distant mission overseas and more like a complicated struggle with no clear end. Each broadcast added another small piece to a growing picture, and that picture did not always match the confident tone coming from official briefings. In homes across the country, quiet conversations began to happen after the news ended. Parents asked questions. Students debated what they were seeing. Veterans watched the footage with a different kind of silence. No one could quite explain it yet, but something had changed. For the first time, a war was unfolding in front of an entire nation, night after night, frame by frame. And once a country begins watching a war that closely, something else begins to happen. People start forming their own conclusions. They start noticing details. They start asking questions that hadn't been asked before. Questions about progress. Questions about strategy. Questions about how long it might last. At first, those questions were quiet, almost whispered, but soon, an event on the other side of the world would bring those doubts into the open and force Americans to confront a possibility few had considered. What if the war they were watching on television was not the war they thought it was? For months, Americans had been hearing the same message. Progress was being made. Military briefings suggested the enemy was weakening. Reports from Washington described a strategy that was slowly but surely working. The war, Americans were told, was difficult, but it was moving in the right direction. Then came the night when everything suddenly felt uncertain. It began during a holiday. In Vietnam, the Lunar New Year was known as Tet. Traditionally, it was a time when fighting slowed. A brief pause in the war. Soldiers on both sides expected a quieter few days. But in the early hours of January 1968, that expectation shattered. Across South Vietnam, coordinated attacks erupted almost at the same moment. Cities that had seemed relatively secure were suddenly under fire. Military bases were hit. Government buildings were stormed. Even the streets of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, were filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. For Americans watching from home, the first images arrived through the evening news. The footage was startling. Television cameras showed fighting not in distant jungles, but inside major cities. Smoke rising above neighborhoods. Soldiers moving cautiously through streets that had once looked calm in previous reports. And one image in particular caught the attention of the entire nation. Attackers had managed to penetrate the grounds of the United States Embassy in Saigon. The building itself remained secure, but the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The embassy represented American presence and authority in the region. Seeing fighting so close to it raised a question many viewers could not shake. If the enemy could strike there, where else could they reach? Night after night, new footage appeared on television screens across the United States. Urban combat in hue. Gunfire echoing through city streets. American troops clearing buildings room by room. The attacks eventually failed to achieve their military goals. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces pushed back the offensive and inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. From a strictly military perspective, the offensive was a defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. But wars are not judged only on the battlefield. They are also judged in the minds of the people watching them. And the images Americans had just seen created a powerful impression. For years, many had believed the enemy was losing strength. Yet the scale and coordination of these attacks suggested something very different. The offensive appeared massive, organized, determined. Viewers began asking themselves a quiet but unsettling question. If the enemy was capable of launching attacks like this across an entire country, how close was victory really? Television played a powerful role in shaping that moment. The war was no longer something described only through official statements or written reports. It was unfolding visually, night after night, in American living rooms. Each broadcast carried new scenes from the offensive. Each scene added another layer of doubt. Families gathered around their televisions watched soldiers fighting in streets and courtyards. They listened to correspondents describing the scale of the attacks. They saw maps covered with markers showing how many cities had been hit at once. Slowly, a gap began to form. On one side were the confident words coming from official briefings. On the other side were the images appearing on television screens. For the first time, millions of Americans began to wonder whether the two were telling the same story. The Tet Offensive did not end the war, but it changed something deeper. It shifted how the war was perceived. After Tet, the conflict in Vietnam no longer looked like a distant operation steadily moving toward victory. It looked unpredictable, complicated, open-ended. And as the weeks passed, one of the most trusted voices in American broadcasting would return from Vietnam with a conclusion that would echo across the entire country. A conclusion that suggested the war might not be nearing victory at all. For years, Americans had trusted the voices that delivered the evening news. At the end of long workdays, families gathered around the television. The room dimmed slightly as the broadcast began. The anchor sat calmly behind a desk, papers neatly arranged, speaking with quiet certainty. Among those voices, one stood above the rest. Walter Cronkite. To millions of Americans, he represented something rare in a time of uncertainty. He was not dramatic. He was not loud. His tone was steady, careful, almost reassuring. When he spoke, it felt like listening to someone who had taken the time to understand the truth. That trust had been built over many years. But in early 1968, something unusual happened. Instead of simply reading reports from Washington or Saigon, Cronkite decided to see the war for himself. He traveled to Vietnam. For days, he moved through areas that had just witnessed some of the most intense fighting of the war. The Tet Offensive had shaken cities across South Vietnam, and the aftermath was still visible everywhere. Destroyed buildings, streets scarred by gunfire, American soldiers still patrolling neighborhoods that had recently been battlefields. Cronkite spoke with commanders. He spoke with soldiers. He observed the situation as closely as a journalist could, and what he saw left an impression. When he returned to the United States, viewers expected the familiar format of the evening news. Reports, updates, the calm delivery they had grown used to. Instead, they saw something different. On February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite delivered a rare editorial at the end of the CBS Evening News. He looked directly into the camera. There was no dramatic music, no raised voice, just a measured tone and carefully chosen words. Cronkite explained that after observing the situation in Vietnam, the war appeared to be moving toward what he called a stalemate. Not a clear victory, not a clear defeat, but a long and uncertain struggle with no obvious end. It was not a speech filled with anger. It was not a political statement. In fact, the power of the moment came from how restrained it was. Cronkite simply described what he believed the evidence showed. For many viewers, that quiet conclusion landed with enormous weight. This was the same journalist who had spent years delivering reports with calm objectivity. If someone like Cronkite was suggesting the war might be stuck in a stalemate, people began to wonder what that meant for the future. The reaction across the country was immediate. Newspapers discussed the broadcast. Political leaders took notice. Conversations began in homes, workplaces, and college campuses. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from inside the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson had spent years defending the American effort in Vietnam. His administration had repeatedly argued that progress was being made and that persistence would eventually bring success. Yet Cronkite's words reached the same audience Johnson needed to keep on his side: Middle America. According to accounts from those close to the president, Johnson reportedly responded to the broadcast with a striking remark: "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Whether spoken exactly that way or not, the sentiment reflected a deeper concern. Public confidence was beginning to shift. Cronkite had not called for immediate withdrawal. He had not condemned the soldiers fighting overseas. His message was far more subtle than that. He suggested that the United States might need to reconsider its expectations. And in doing so, he gave voice to doubts that many Americans had already begun to feel after watching the events of Tet unfold on television. The impact of that moment extended far beyond one broadcast. It represented a turning point in how the war was discussed. For years, the conflict had been framed largely through official statements and military briefings. Now, one of the nation's most trusted journalists had publicly acknowledged the possibility that the war might not be progressing the way Americans had been told. The effect was quiet but powerful. Confidence did not collapse overnight. But something important had changed. More Americans began questioning how long the war might continue. More began wondering whether victory was truly within reach. And more began paying closer attention to the reports coming out of Vietnam each night. The conversation about the war was no longer controlled by a single narrative. It had opened, and soon another revelation would emerge that would push that national conversation even further, forcing Americans to confront a story that many found deeply disturbing. In late 1969, a story began to surface that few Americans were prepared to hear. At first, it appeared quietly. A small report, a name mentioned in passing, a village most people in the United States had never heard of. My Lai. For more than a year, the event had remained largely unknown to the American public. The war in Vietnam was already producing daily headlines, and countless operations were happening across the countryside. But this story was different, and once it emerged, it would become impossible to ignore. It began when investigative journalists started digging into reports about an operation carried out in March of 1968 by a unit of American soldiers in the Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam. The mission had been described as a search and destroy operation. Intelligence suggested enemy fighters were present in the area. The village was believed to be a Viet Cong stronghold. What happened next, however, did not resemble a typical battle. When soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai, they encountered mostly civilians, elderly villagers, women, children, farmers. Yet the operation spiraled into something far darker. Over the course of several hours, hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians were killed. For months, the incident remained buried inside military channels. Reports were incomplete. Details were unclear. The war itself was producing so many operations that the story never fully surfaced. But eventually, soldiers who had witnessed what happened began speaking. One of them, a young helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson, had tried to intervene during the event. Flying overhead, he saw civilians being threatened and placed his aircraft between American troops and the villagers. His actions were unusual, risky, and for a long time, largely unknown. As investigators slowly gathered testimonies, journalists began uncovering the scale of the tragedy. When the story finally reached major newspapers and television broadcasts in 1969, the reaction across the United States was immediate. Americans had already been watching a difficult war on their television screens. Now they were confronted with something even more unsettling. Photographs from the village began appearing in print, images that showed the aftermath of the killings, images that forced readers to pause. For many Americans, the news was deeply shocking. The United States had long seen its soldiers as representatives of a nation fighting for freedom and stability. The idea that American troops could be involved in such an event was painful to process. Debates erupted across the country. Some people questioned how such a tragedy could occur in the chaos of guerrilla warfare. Others demanded accountability and answers. Military investigations began. Court proceedings followed. The name My Lai quickly became one of the most controversial moments of the entire Vietnam War. But the deeper impact was not limited to the courtroom. The story intensified a national conversation that had already been growing since the Tet Offensive and the shifting tone of media coverage. For many Americans, the war was no longer just a distant strategic conflict in Southeast Asia. It had become a moral question. Universities held heated discussions. Families debated around dinner tables. Protest movements gained new momentum as more citizens began asking what the United States was truly trying to achieve in Vietnam. Television and newspapers continued covering the story, bringing details into public view in ways that had rarely happened during previous wars. The war was still being fought overseas, but the argument about the war was now happening inside the United States itself, and that debate would shape the final years of the conflict. Looking back, historians often describe the Vietnam War as a turning point not only for American military strategy, but also for the relationship between war, media, and public opinion. Never before had a conflict been documented so closely. Never before had images and reports traveled so quickly into the homes of ordinary citizens. And never before had the American public been able to watch, question, and debate a war in real time. The television screen had become more than a source of information. It had become a mirror reflecting the realities of war back to the nation fighting it. By the early 1970s, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Political leaders began searching for ways to bring American involvement to an end. Negotiations intensified. Troop withdrawals slowly began. The war would continue for several more years. But something irreversible had already happened. Vietnam had changed how Americans saw war, and it had changed how war would be shown to Americans. Because after Vietnam, military leaders understood something that had never been fully clear before. Battles are fought on the ground, but wars are also fought in the minds of the people watching them. And once a nation begins questioning a war, the course of history can quietly begin to change. But there is one more question that still lingers. If television helped turn public opinion during Vietnam, why did the U.S. military change how later wars were reported? The answer to that question reveals how Vietnam reshaped American warfare in ways that are still influencing conflicts today.